in the Torah. Furthermore, by all other averos, if you have a schus, right, you have a schus, some type of merit. Because also remember again, whenever I commit an avera, the good news is I always have some type of countermeasure. Right, I always have some type of positive dynamic activity, in my personal arsenal. So again, if I have a schus, that could go ahead and literally suspend judgment for 2 to 3 generations. Now, what does that do? So suspension of judgment, right? The Ramchal writes about this. The Ramchal, he writes, really, Midas Hadin says that if you do an Avera, what should happen? Onesh. And punishment. And when should Onesh come? When should punishment come? Immediately. So Midas Harachamim, the divine attribute of mercy suspends judgment. Now what does that suspension of judgment do? It allows for tshuva. That's the Akadosh Baruch Hu works. He gives us time to work things through. Now, amazingly enough, how much time? So here the Gemara says it could be up to 2 or 3 generations. That literally, again, a person commits an Aveira, and then again, halacha l'maisa, I have mitzvos. Ultimately, again, there's some suspension, right? There's some suspended sentence to allow me to work through everything. V'kan nifra'in mimenu la'alter. But here, ultimately, what happens? But here, so judgment is exacted immediately. By Shua Shav Shene Amar, Hotzei Sia Nu'om Hashem Tzavakos, Uba al Beis Haganav, the Beis Hanishba Bishmila Shakar, the Lana Besoch Beso, the Kala, Ves Itzav, Ves Avana, Hotzei Sia Le'alter. And it was actually very interesting. So the Gemara is quoting from the Pasuk from Zechariah. So literally the Pasuk says, I will take him out, right, and I will come to the house of the thief, to the house of the one who swears in my name falsely. Literally, again, I will remain in this house and destroy the wood, the stones, and take them out immediately. Okay, so what does this mean? Right? Ultimately, again, what does it mean? I will come to the house of the thief. This refers to people. Who's the thief? This refers to a person who deceives others. Like, for example, what is the example of this deception? Let's say Ruvain he didn't lend anybody to Shimon, but he claimed his Vatano. He claims that he lent money to Shimon, right? And he ultimately adjures him. And I will come into the house of the one who swears falsely. So I will dwell within his house, the kolso, and destroy it. And his wood and his stones. Even things that fire can't destroy, like stone. Right? Fire can't destroy stone, even things like that. Shvuas Sheker does destroy. The power of Shvuah is so profoundly overwhelming that it destroys everything. Im Amar, Eini Nishba, if he says at the end of the day, I will not swear, Potrino Somiad. So we'll say, so now again, so pause here for just a moment. So obviously, the Gemara highlighting the destructive nature of Shvuas Sheker. If he says, Im Amar Eini Nishba, if he says, ultimately, again, I won't swear, Pochino Somiad. Now, this is referring to the person who's being adjured, right? So remember again, Ruvain is bringing Shimon to din. Shimon, let's say again, is a modeh b'miktas, right? So Ruvain says, you owe me $1,000. Shimon says, no, I only owe you $500. So what's the halacha? If ultimately, again, if Shimon says, I won't swear, Pochino Somiad. Ultimately, again, so they literally they cause him to leave Beis Din. I will say now, obviously, when if you refuse to swear, so that means you're going to be liable, right? Obviously, but the idea over here is the moment you say I'm not swearing, Beis Din sends you on your way. Now, what does this mean? If you look at Rashi says over here, Pochino Somiyad, V'mashin also. We do not leave him in Beis Din. Why? See where Rashi says, Shkan shelo yachzerbo, right? Ultimately, in order that he should not change his mind, Yakein yishver v'akar yishalim miyad shekib alav Beis Din. So again, once if you decide I'm not swearing, so obviously you pay immediately, right? You charge your credit card immediately. You leave Beis Din as quickly as we don't want you changing your mind. I'm just changing my mind. Good. Now, what if again the clay, right? The response? The responder. Right? The responder says again, I'm ready to swear. I'm ready to swear. I'm already nishba. Ha'omdim sham omrim zeh lozeh suruna me'al ohalei ha'anashim harishahim ha'ila. So you begin to see the severity with which halacha goes ahead and treats shvua. That literally, again, if the guy says, right, so the responder says, I'm going to go ahead and swear, right? So again, Reuben's claiming against Shimon. Shimon says, fine, I'll swear. So what does the halacha? So Beis Din says, okay, Chevra, clear away again from these wicked men. Rabbi said, by the way, just so you understand, that's Lashon by Alas Korach. Right, so again, that is a very, very, very strong Lashon over here. But what's also fascinating is both parties are considered to be Rishoy. Both the claimant and the responder, which is actually very interesting. We'll come back to that. Also, and when we adjure, we'll call him Shimon. We say to him, just understand, we are not adjuring you based on your understanding of this oath. Which we actually saw this Gemara before. Rather, we're adjuring you on the understanding. In other words, you are not determining or defining the scope of this Shavuot. We are determining and defining the scope of this Shavuot. As Moshe Rabbeinu said to Klal Yisrael when he adjured us, right? When he adjured us the Shavuot to go and accept Torah. So ultimately, again, Moshe Rabbeinu says, just understand, I'm adjuring you based on my das and the das of the Ribono Shel Olam, Shneimar, v'lo etchem levadchem, ki es asher yeshnu po, ein li elo osen ha'omdim al Sinai. So I only know those when Moshe Rabbeinu adjured us. So I only know ultimately, again, those who are standing at Har Sinai. How do I know? The Gemara says, Doras haboim, v'gerim ha'asidim le'искaya minayin. So Moshe said, this is truly beautiful. How do we know that when Moshe Rabbeinu adjured us, right, with the Torah? Because remember, we undertook a shvuah to uphold Torah. How do I know that shvuah applies to those who stood at Har Sinai and those who came later on, right, and even those who converted? How do I know? Talmud Lomar ve'is asher einenu. So the Gemara says, because the pasuk says, even those who are not here, everyone was included in Klal Yisrael. Future generations of Jews, future generations of Gerim, all were included in the original Shvuah at Har Sinai. Incredible. So the Gemara says, which by the way, there's an interesting discussion in general about whether or not a ger is allowed to say the bracha of Shelo Asani Goy. Right? What does a ger say? Is that to a ger? If you think about it, conceptually, it's not true. You spoke with this person, a guy, and then they decided to convert. So it's not each thing that focus in halacha. There is a school of thought that says no, a ger is ultimately again allowed to be Shelo Asani Goy. Why based on this Gemara? Because if you understand that the neshamas of Gerim ultimately again were included in the original Shua at Har Sinai. So that means to a certain respect, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's interesting. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're right, maybe he didn't make this person Jewish, but if HaKadosh Baruch Hu made this person a ger, now that might sound strange because a ger, of course, is a Jew. But Lamais again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu marked that neshama in a certain way, almost like in a way of binding it in an irrevocable way with the destiny of Klal Yisrael. It's fascinating because again, a ger is included in the Shvuah of Har Sinai. Incredible. The Gemara says as follows: So I only know about saying that the Shvuah of Moshe Rabbeinu included the mitzvahs that Klal Yisrael received at Har Sinai. Mitzvahs Hasidos says Chadish. How do I know that the Shvuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, included mitzvot that would be introduced later on in Jewish history as well? Talmud Lomar, Kimu v'Kiblu. The says Kimu v'Kiblu, Kaimu ma shekiblu kvar. Ultimately, again, they upheld that which they already accepted. So we'll say, so amazingly enough, the Shvuah at Har Sinai applied to all the mitzvahs that had been given at Har Sinai, and also applied ultimately again to any mitzvahs that they would accept in the future. It was an all-encompassing Shvuah. Incredible. The Gemara says, "My afhi bil shorim." So we'll say, it's not the Gemara just jumps back for just a second. When the Gemara introduced this sugya on the last line of Lamed Ches Amud Beis, so the Gemara used lashon of afi b'shorei lemar, which sounds like over here that Shvuas Hadayanin can be made even the lashon of Gemara is even in any language. So Gemara says, what does that mean? Even in, right? Even Shvuas Hadayanin can be made in any language. So what does this mean? My afi b'shorei lemar can be not elu lemar b'chol lashon. These are the things that can be said in any language. Parsha Sota, right? The Parsha Sota, Vidui Meiser, which means the confession, the Kodesh Menabayis, which is the statement that says I've dispersed my tithes. Kriya Shema, Tfilah Shmona Esrei, Bechas Hamazon, Ushvuas Ha'edus, Ushvuas Ha'pikadon, V'Amar Nami, V'Kamer Nami Shvuas Hadayon and Afi B'Shorei Lemar. And therefore, again, the Gemara of the Brisa is adding on to this. Is, by the way, also Shvuas Hadayon and ultimately again could also be said in any language. Amar Mar, so what's the Gemara says? Amar Mar. We say to the responder, have you idea? Shekala olam kulon is dar zebusha Hashem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Sisa Hashem Kach Halashat. So let's say, so we tell him again before he takes the shul, we say to him, understand the severity of not taking Hashem's name in vain, not taking a false shvua. Because when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the dibra, Sisa Hashem, do not take my name in vain, the entire world shook. So why is that? So in other words, in my time, why did the world shake? When the HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave over Lo Sisa, if it's because it was given over at Har Sinai, well, if that's the case, Eser Digos Mem Yisai. Remember, again, all 10 commandments were given at Har Sinai. So why is that unique? It must be because Shvuas Shav, a false oath, is so severe. Only Chamira, is it so severe? Batman, Elohim Kalos, Asevalo Sase, Chutzmilo Sisa. What are examples again of Kalos, right? They'll call them more lenient mitzvahs and averos, and Asevalo Sase, by positive commandments and prohibitions. Those fall into the category of Kalos, except for Lo Sisa. Remember again, taking Hashem's name in vain, technically speaking, is a Lo Sase. The Gemara says, okay, even though it's a Lo Sase, it doesn't fall into the category of Kalos. What's the next category? Chamulos, more severe averos. What does that refer to? Zokrisos umisos bezdin. This refers to kares, right? Things that carry kares and misas bezdin. The lo sisa imahen, and lo sisa is included in the category of krisos umisos bezdin. So I would say that's pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing. You're taking a false oath, taking Hashem's name in vain, is included in the category of capital cases. Kares and misas bezdin. But still, okay, so if it's in that category, then the whole world should shake any time someone does something that's chayiv kares or misas bezdin. Why is Shvuah Shav unique? The kind of lo yinakeh. One of the reasons why it's so severe? By all other things in the Torah, the pasuk says v'nakeh, you can be cleansed. Shuv is possible. By Shvuas Shav, you went for 1 second. Is that true by all of the Torah? Is that true that by other averos it doesn't say lo yinakeh, that you're not cleansed? The pasuk says v'nakeh lo yinakeh. I'll give a close side. The pasuk itself says there are some things for which you are cleansed and some things for which you are not cleansed. How do you know which one is which? The sign of Belazar, Rabbi say incredible. It's impossible to say that there's absolution for mitzvah averos, because on the other hand it says lo yinakeh, you're not absolved. And then you can't say lo yinakeh why? Shekvar ne'emar yinakeh, that you can't be absolved. So how do you reconcile this? Haketzad menakeh hu l'shavim ve'ena menakeh l'she'en l'shavim. Right, Rabbi say, what do you see from here? HaKadosh Baruch Hu absolves those who do tshuva and does not absolve those who don't do tshuva. And we're saying, what an incredibly overwhelming Gemara. Right? At the end of the day, the power of tshuva, v'nakeh lo yinakeh, life is a choice. Right? We all commit mistakes. We all engage in averos. The shaila is, what do you do in the aftermath of that? If you do tshuva, then ultimately again v'nakeh. And if I don't do tshuva, lo yinakeh. Now Rashi makes an amazing observation over here. Rashi says over here, v'nakeh l'shavim, they can af l'shavim lo yinakeh v'lo piron. So what about Shvuah Shav? So by Shvuah Shav, again, is there tshuva by Shvuah Shav? So there's tshuva for everything. Here's the difference. The difference just is that by Shvuah Shav, even if you do tshuva, right? Even if you do tshuva, there's no tshuva below Pirah. Ultimately, there's a punishment. There's a punishment. By other forms of tshuva, the tshuva can be so powerful to wipe the slate clean. By Shvuas Shav, ultimately, again, the Aveira is so tremendous that even with tshuva, there's still pirah, there still has to be onesh. They will say, this is actually a fascinating yesod, because the truth is, it's also true in Adam Mechavera. Right? In Adam Mechavera, this happens all the time as well, which is, I wronged another person. Even if you wrong another person and you do tshuva, there's still fallout from that, right? In other words, the relationship is still damaged. You see this all the time. Yeah, I could say to say you're sorry. I can apologize, even like a heartfelt apology. When you hurt someone, that hurt remains. If you think about it, Shvuas Shav is a personal trespass against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if we're saying over here is, can you do tshuva for Shvuas Shav? Of course you can. But at the end of the day, there's a residual trauma to the relationship that often cannot be undone. It remains. You hurt another person, you can say you're sorry, they can accept your apology. The relationship is probably, under certain circumstances, is forever changed. Cannot be put back to what it was before. Shvuas Shav, you can do tshuva, but even with tshuva, there's pirah, and there's still going to be fallout from that. Incredible. The Gemara was like, the kind of So now we are analyzing the brisa we just said before. So, for example, by other averos, so if I do an aveira, I'm punished for it. Here, I'm punished, and so is my mishpacha. So is that true? By other averos, punishment is not exacted from your family. B'aksiv, v'santiani es panei ba'isho mishpachto. Tanya b'shimin, im hu chata, mishpachto ma chata. Shabbos says, so the pasuk sounds like over here, Baruch Hu says, I'll exact punishment from this individual, from his family. Why should Hashem exact punishment from my family? If I committed the Aveira, so the punishment should be exacted from me. What does my family have to do? We'll say, this is a wild Gemara. Any family where one member is a tax collector, ultimately, again, they're all tax collectors. And if one family member is a crook, right? She'ein kol listim. Ultimately, they're all crooks. Why? She'ein, Gemara says, mipnei shemechapen alav. Ultimately, again, because they cover for him. They will say, this is a very difficult Gemara to fully unravel. They will say, on one hand, right, you think about this, right, parents go through this all the time with their kids. My child does something bad. So it's easy, of course, to say, it's the parents. What kind of chinuch? What kind of chinuch in the home? Right? The child does something like that. So let's say, we know in life that parents can do all the right things. Children have this really interesting thing called free choice. Right? And they can take all of the beautiful chinuch that parents have given them and literally throw it out the window and do their own thing. So on one hand, definitely sometimes children do things that is not reflective of their parents' upbringing or their chinuch. But the Gemara sensitizing us to is, however, when our children behave in a certain way, it is incumbent upon us as parents to introspect and to look at how we are living, and to look at the home that we are building, and to look at the chinuch that we have given. Why? Because when our children do certain things, we are not guilt-free. We are not blameless. Am I at fault? No, that's too strong of a word, because my child, especially as they get older, has free will. But if my kid is behaving in a certain way, in a consistent fashion, if my children is exhibiting certain character traits in an ongoing fashion, I have to introspect, and I have to ask myself, is it possibly coming from me? Is there something in my home? Is there something in my life Is there something in the way that I live? Again, I will say, and there's this fine line. Is it my fault? No. It's very important to understand. As we talk like adult children, they have the ability to make their own decisions. But at the same time, this child grew up in my home. This child grew up under my tutelage. This child grew up with my chinuch. So as such, am I totally uninvolved in this result? No, and that's the Chazal are saying. So again, there's a family where the kid is a tax collector, which was considered to be a very unscrupulous profession. So if somebody was becoming a tax collector, the Gemara says, whoa, what happened in that house? Or my child is a ganav, or again, my child exhibits any kind of, my child just did something really bad. Again, do I have to accept full responsibility for what my kids do? No. But do I have to introspect as a parent, wondering what am I doing in my life? What am I doing in my home? Absolutely, yes. Incredible. So it says, Hasan, Bedina Achmina, Hacha Bedina Didei. So the Gemara says over here, So therefore the Gemara says at the end of the day, what do you see? So the Gemara says, you see from here that ultimately, again, there is responsibility even by other Averos. So the Gemara says, you're right. So we'll say, my family could always have responsibility for the negative things that I do, but the shaila is, how are they ultimately held accountable? Are they held accountable to the same standard that I am, or are they held accountable to a different standard? Give the sign. Rabbi says, really fascinating. Rabbi Omer, Rasi also. So once it says, I will cut him off. So not telling them the fish, I might have thought it was established that when I commit an Avera, that my family is held to some level of accountability as well. I might have thought that my family is held to the very same level of accountability that I am. The Gemara says, no, chas v'shalom. I might be chayiv chas v'shalom kares. My family is not held to that same standard. In other words, that when I sin, there's absolutely some level of familial responsibility, but my family is never held to the same level that I am. The Chalaver Shabbatorah, Nifraim Mimeno Bekan Mimeno Mikala Olukol. Which I will say, by the way, is such an overwhelming yesod that when I sin, every sin carries with it some level of familial responsibility. So I will say, it gets you to think twice about committing an Avera. No, because often when we sin, the reason I sin is because I assume that the fallout of my actions is limited to me. Now that I understand that every single thing that I do does have an impact on my family as well, it just makes me think twice. Right? I don't want to do something to my wife. I don't want to do something to my kids. I don't want to do something to my parents. I don't want to do something to my extended family. So suddenly now it makes us measure our actions just a little bit more. Incredible. So the Gemara goes back to the So I all the Averos. Again, usually retribution is exacted from me, but not from the world. Yet by Shvuas Shav, the retribution is exacted from everyone. Is that true? That by other Averos, retribution is not exacted from the world? I will say, but it's not true. Whenever we commit an Avera, there is mutual responsibility. I'm responsible for your Averas, you're responsible for my Averas. So at the end of the day, it's not just by Shvuas Shav, it's by everything. Amr Bezer Osai, Hasam is incredible. Shirish b'yad minchos v'lo michu. So ultimately, again, no. But in other cases, when is there collective responsibility? When I have the ability to stop someone else or to object to someone's Avera, and I fail to do so, then there is collective responsibility. But at the end of the day, if I don't have the ability to object, then there's not collective responsibility. By Shvuas Shav, ultimately, again, there's collective responsibility, even if I can't object to someone else's errant behavior, which is tremendous. Again, we'll see why that is. So the Gemara says, okay, let's analyze this. Now let's say, now the Gemara used the following Lashon. So what is the distinction between Rishaim of the world and Rishaim of my Mishpach? Now, what is when the Gemara uses the phrase Rishaim? Rishaim over here means people who have the ability to object, but don't object to my errant behavior. So again, what's the chiluk between if those Rishaim are in my family or in the world? They tzadikim the Mishpach, tzadikim dama. Tzadikim over here refers to people who have no ability to object. So whether they're tzaddikim in my family or tzaddikim in the world. So here we go. So the Gemara says, who is shara averas b'dinei? So currently, if I commit an avera, I am held accountable for the punishment, for the din of that avera. The Rishon of my family, that refers to family members who have the ability to go ahead and object to my errant behavior and fail to do so. They don't get the same punishment I get, but they still get a more severe punishment. Also, do you hear this? If you are a family member and members of your family, your children, your spouse, someone else is doing something wrong, and you don't do anything about it, you let your kids continue down a negative path and you don't stop it, you're held responsible. You're held responsible. Even for adult children, you're held responsible. And again, not the same level of responsibility as the perpetrator himself, but again, a second-tier responsibility. Or Rishon D'Alma, and again, Rishon D'Alma refers to people who are outside of the mishpacha, but still have the ability to object and don't do so. Still a lower level of judgment. And I will say, so again, so in general averus, the perpetrator gets the highest level of punishment. Family members who can object but don't do so, second tier punishment. Outsiders who can object and don't do so, third tier. Okay? Tzaddikim, the Gemara says, Tzaddikim dahacha p'tiri. Tzaddikim, whether they're in the family or outside of the family. Now again, what does that mean, tzaddikim? Tzaddikim are people who either are unaware of what's going on, can't have an impact on what's going on, are not held culpable at all. Okay, so we'll say that's the realm of general averus. Gabi shvua. What about again by shvua? Gabi shvua. Who rishon the mishpachto b'dinei. So we'll say when it comes to shvuas shav. So what's the halacha? Who? So the perpetrator. Who rishon the mishpachto. Rishon the mishpachto means what? Family members who have the ability to stop this type of behavior, and don't do so, are held similarly accountable. The boss say, you hear this? So again, the person who takes the shvuas shav and his family members who have allowed for the cultivation of this type of personality are all held accountable to the same level. Rishon D'Alma, B'din Chamer, ultimately again, Rishon outside of the family are held liable to one tier below. Tzaddikim dahacha b'din hakal. Ultimately, again, it's tzaddikim. Tzaddikim in the family, tzaddikim on the outside. I was like, who are tzaddikim? Tzaddikim ultimately, again, are people who halacha l'maaseh again seem to have like no involvement in this yet, are still held responsible. Now, let's say, now, what does this mean? Hold on for 1 second. Let's do 2 more lines. So, ultimately, again, now, let's say, again, the respondent. Good. The respondent says, if he says, I'm not swearing, you know what? He handed that to him. He's like, I'm out. Right? I'm out. I got to pay the money, right? I'm out. Which again is what we prefer. So what happens? Good. You see, which I just want to point out. What's the beauty of this Gemara? The beauty of this Gemara is it allows the respondent to save face. Why? Well, so, the best way to conduct a negotiation is how? Where no one has to admit that they're wrong, right? If everybody can walk away from a negotiation feeling that they're right, that's the best way. What's the beauty of this Gemara? Someone could say, you know what? I'm not going to swear, I'm going to pay. And he could hold his head high, right? Because otherwise, before this Gemara, you would have said, if a guy says, I'm not swearing, I'll pay, what is that essentially? What is that? An admission of guilt. Now, suddenly, what is it? An expression of profound piety. I treat Shua so carefully that I'd rather pay money and not take the Lord's name in vain. It's godless. What it allows a person to do is save face without having to admit guilt. So again, but if, however, Shimon says, no, I'm still going to swear him, Amar Harini Nishbal, Ha'omdim Sham Omrim Zelazah, Suranami Al-Aleh Anashmayr. So the Gemara says, I don't understand that. We'll say, what it sounds like over here, so let's say Shimon says, I'm swearing. So what does the baby say? Okay, Chevra, make way, right? You might want to get out of here because the ground is about to open up. This is not going to be good. And I will say, it refers to both of them, the claimant and the respondent. And I don't understand. So he must understand. I understand by referring to Shimon, the swearer, as a bad guy. But why Ruvain? Right? Ruvain the claimant. Ruvain is the guy who lent Shimon money. I understand. Why is he included in this statement of Rishayim? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you. The Gemara says, Shimon ben Tarfon Omer, Shvuas Hashem Tia Ben Shneim. Ultimately, we'll say when a person takes a shvuah, that shvuah is between two people, between the claimant and the respondent. There are two people involved in that shvuah. Melamed shechala shvuah al shneim. It teaches us that the shvuah ultimately again devolves upon both of them, and there is liability ultimately again for both of them. Now, why? The most take a look at Rashi. Top Rashi on the daf. This is actually wild. Rashi says chala al shneim sheshneim ne'enoshim ba. Both parties are punished for a shvuah. How so? Shalo diktek limsa mamono biyad ne'eman ubo lidechel Hashem. This is wild. So the swearer, I understand why he's going to be liable. What about again the claimant? What about Ruvain? Ruvain, why are you lending money? Why are you engaging in business with dishonest people? So I'll say it's fascinating. So they're both held liable. One for swearing, and one for engaging with people who are not of good credibility. Don't hang around and don't do business and don't lend money with people who lack credibility. We'll say about it. There's another reason also, which is, the halacha is, the halacha is, you are not allowed to lend money without witnesses, and you are not allowed to pay back loan without witnesses. And in fact, the kids are written down. The kids says if you do so, you are in violation of lifnei ivar lo sitei michshol. So you see from here, the only way to run into a situation like this is how if you're not conducting business in the right way, because otherwise it's common sense. Do stuff with witnesses, otherwise you're going to get stuff. So therefore, the only way to get into this is with people who are not following the halacha. So if you're not following the halacha and it's ending up with shvuah, ultimately again there's liability and culpability with this. So I will say, so now after this fight, the Gemara is now going to get into the mechanics of modern mitzvahs. But before we get to that, so what is this? Like, right, the Gemara just spent a whole amud and a half focusing so intently on the severity of shvuas shav. So what is this severity? So I just want to point out there's a beautiful Marsha. The Marsha says over here, he says, because things is hamavor, sheshmo shal yisbarach hagadol, hu kiyumo shal olam, the yisodo sheba bara ha'olamos. The name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the very engine of creation. The name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the very thing which was his gracious bara Elokim, as Hashemayim b'Asar. Shem Hashem means that what did Hashem initially create the universe with? What did he create it with? His name. His name. Gracious bara Elokim. Elokim, the very essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The name of the Ribono Shel Olam is what created the very building blocks, the very chomer of creation. When you misuse that name, ultimately again, what you are doing is undermining the very rubric, the very foundation of creation itself. And to take it one step further, we'll say, what is a Shvuas Shav? What is a Shvuas Shav? The Shvuas Shav essentially corrupts two things. Number one, it corrupts Dibur. Like when you swear falsely, you're taking that koach hadibor, right, that koach of speech, which is the very thing that defines us as people. It's what makes us us. What distinguishes man, ultimately again, from animal. It's not the ability to walk. Animals can walk also. It's not the ability to reproduce. Animals can reproduce also. It's not even the ability to think. Animals could think also. What sets aside man ultimately again from animal is Rahman Malala, like Uncle calls it, speech. A false oath is the fundamental corruption of speech. Fundamentally undermines all speech. And therefore, halacha l'maisa again, the Gemara says that when this goes ahead and occurs, so at the end of the day, what is man doing? He's fundamentally undermining his very self. So you're undermining the world. You're undermining gracious. You're undermining yourself. And then what else? What else does Shvuas Shav do? Shvuas Shav also is the ultimate trespass. If you swear falsely, then there's nothing sacred. Like you can't take anyone at their word. You can't do anything. So Moses, you understand what happens when you take a false oath? You're undermining creation, being Adam Lamakom. Right? Ultimately, again, you're undermining human relationships and integrity, being Adam Machavero. And you're undermining your very essence, the power of your speech, being Adam Atzmo. So when you take this false oath, you've eroded every single pillar upon which the world stands. The Gemara says you do something like that, an unforgivable offense. Fundamentally undermining anything and everything that holds the world up. Right, let's stop over here today. Tremendous Gemara. Right, so that's another great day, everyone.
What do you make of this? What's going on here?
Right, dear friend. Yes. See, you can actually blame your parents. You can parents everything.
He has millions of subscribers, but I don't really know anything about this. That's not of my pay grade. That's here, like doing things like that, right? Can I throw out a hypothesis on my end? Okay. So I saw some people saying like, oh, look how pathetic the UFC is. They're buying views to prop up UFC BJJ. But let's be honest, it's the UFC. They don't need to buy views. They're the freaking most dominant force in all combat sports. So UFC makes money, right? Like they don't like. It's the third event. They're trying to build something new. Okay. Is it possible? I don't know. But is it possible? You can buy views on someone else's page. You can attach those.
All right, General Sai, good morning, a good tava. Hopefully you had a beautiful and uplifting Shabbos. A great is the first time to begin the new week together. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our annual Pamator sponsor, Totzim Mishpach Amaretz Yisrael, for dedicating Orishim and Drashos this year as a zechus for the Soros Tavos for all of Am Yisrael. Our Pamator sponsors for the month of Stephen Abavin, Lotova, Stephen Tarizin, and loving memory of Steve's mother, Doris Zin, Devorah Bas for Bisol Yoel. On the occasion of our 50th yard site, we are narrative about Talmud Torah. Inshallah, have an aliyah, the family in the phone. Also, with that, and of course, we always be dedicated to learning the schos of our precious hostages, making Shpach and Merit Hashem, bring them home to Shalom and the Kara and the merit of our holy soldiers, making Shpach and Merit Hashem, protect them, give them Shmir Yisrael, allow them to be successful in all of their endeavors, and indeed come back to their families with Shalom and the Kara. Also with that, so let's begin. Thank you to Richter for giving shir yesterday. Today we are starting on Lamed Ches, on the 38a on the top of the daf. Hopefully you did your homework. And there's Hashem from last night, as I put out on the chat. So we are starting at the two dots. And there's Hashem. You gotta check the chat. Also, if I enjoy it, there's no way we're gonna be able to keep up and that's what the pace this week. A lot of Gemara to do ahead of us, so we're starting from two dots on top. So Shuas HaPikadon Keitzad, Peinli Pikadon Sheish Lebiyadecha. Okay, so let's remember again, what we're now going to get into is a really fascinating topic regarding, we saw in the Mishnah two different types of cases, where sometimes a person would be going ahead and answering up claims from multiple people, or would also be going ahead and making multiple oaths towards one person. So there was a tension in the Mishnah as to when halacha l'maisa, again, when is a person, and obviously we're talking about a case where they lied, right, with the shua, when would there be a situation where they would be chayiv once, versus when would there be a situation where they would be chayiv multiple times. So that's what we're going to analyze and kind of dissect a little bit. So Tana Abanon, Klal inu chayiv ela achas. So for example, if a person goes ahead and let's say bunch or bundles multiple oaths into one statement and they transgress to only chayiv once. But if you specify, ultimately again you are chayiv on every single individual shvua. Again, the specifics of that we're going to see in just a little bit. These ones are there. Yehuda says, but Yehuda Omer, and Yehuda says like this: Shvua lo lecha, v'lo lecha, chayiv al kol achas v'achas. So Yehuda says, if a person, let's say again, I go right, let's say 5 people come over to me, and each of them are making a claim that I owe them some item, right, some pikadon, and what's the halacha? I say, shvua lo lecha, I swear I don't owe to you, v'lo lecha, and not to you, and v'lo lecha, and not to you, and then it turns out that I'm lying. I'm going to be chayiv ultimately again for every single shvua. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Eliezer says, lo lecha, v'lo lecha, shvua Rabbi Eliezer builds on Rabbi Yehuda, and he says it's not enough. See, Rabbi Yehuda's whole point is you have to say lo lecha, velo lecha, velo lecha, velo lecha. So Rabbi Eliezer builds on this, and he says yes, you have to say velo lecha, velo lecha, velo lecha, but you also have to add in the word shvua afterwards. That putting shvua at the end makes it individuated, or right, individualized shvua, and therefore again creates individual liability. Incredible. Rabbi Shimon says, Ach yomer shvua l'chol achas v'ach. Rabbi Shimon comes along and he says, no, in order to create individual liability, you actually have to say shvua lo lecha, shvua lo lecha, shvua lo lecha. So it says, so this is the tension. What needs to be said in order to create individual liability? And obviously, in the absence of individual liability, there's only going to be what we'll call collective liability, that klal versus the prat. I'm going to do the Mishmuel. Rabbi Yehuda says in the Mishmuel, klalo shel Rabbi Meir, prato shel Rabbi Yehuda. Essentially, what is a klal case, right, an inclusive case where only creates one level of liability. So klal shel Rabbi Meir is the prat, is the individual case of Rabbi Yehuda. Again, about this you understand over here what klal and prat means in this context. So klal ultimately again refers to the idea that there's only going to be chayiv once, right? Because everybody's grouped, essentially, all the claimants are grouped into one shvua, versus prat, which is going to mean, again, all the claimants are broken out, are individualized, and therefore there's going to be liability for each individual shvua. So Shmuel comes along and says, Rabbi says, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines down from the top. So Shmuel says like this: the klal of Rabbi Meir, ultimately is the equivalent to the prat of Rabbi Yehuda, and klalos Rabbi Yehuda, pratos Rabbi Meir. Okay, that's Shmuel says. We'll see this play out a little bit more specifically in the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan says, Hakol modin b'velo lecha shehu prat. So we'll say Rabbi Yochanan comes along and says, no, everyone agrees that if you say velo lecha, now we have to be very specific with our wording over here. What Rabbi Yochanan is really focusing on is the vav. That velo, not lo lecha, but velo lecha. That introduction of the ve ultimately creates individuated liability. So this is very interesting. Rabbi Yochanan understands over here. He says that everyone agrees in the lo lecha. So again, if I say shvua, that I don't have your pikadon, right? Velo lecha, that everyone will agree that halacha lama, and then it turns out that I'm lying. Of course, all these cases presuppose that I'm lying. So halacha lama, Rabbi Yochanan says everyone agrees that I'll be chayav for each individual claimant, each individual shvua. Where's the machlokes? When I say lo lecha, without the vav, is there individual liability in that case? Rabbi Meir says prat. Rabbi Meir says even lo lecha without the vav is still a prat, it's still individual shvua. Rabbi Yehuda says no, it's a klal. Okay, let's analyze. Rabbi Meir. So what's in Rabbi Meir's world? What's his klal? Because also remember again, interestingly enough, we quoted a number of different opinions. We quoted Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Shimon. But interestingly enough, 3 out of those 4, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, quoted specific cases. Rabbi Meir did not quote the specific case. All Rabbi Meir said was like a general rule. He says, klal, like if you included all of the claimants in one general denial, you only chayav once. If you specified the claimants, or you specified the denial to the respective claimants, then you chayav for every single one. But Rabbi Meir himself did not articulate what is a klal and what is a prat. So the Ezehu klal shaymer. And what is Rabbi Meir's klal? Shvua she'ein lachem biyadi. So we'll say Rabbi Meir's klal would be like this. So imagine again, there are 5 people claiming against me, right? Each of them are claiming that I have something of theirs in my possession. And I just say, Shvua she'ein lachem biyadi. I swear I have nothing that belongs to any of you in my possession. Rabbi Meir says that's a klal. Now what's interesting to note is, based on that, anything therefore that would be more specific, according to Rabbi Meir, would be a prat. So it doesn't, Rabbi Meir seems not to mechalik between lo lecha and velo lecha. Both of those would be prat cases. Okay, so what are they arguing about? Interestingly enough, remember, I want to point out that Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan are arguing in Rabbi Meir. So now the Gemara says, what is the point of their contention? What are they arguing about? So the Gemara said, Shmuel died in the Braisa, Rabbi Yochanan died in the Nisim. Shmuel is medayik from a Braisa, and Rabbi Yochanan is medayik from a Mishnah. Shmuel died in the Braisa, Shmuel infers from a Braisa. What's the case? We become Rabbi Huda. So again, Shmuel says like this. From the fact that Rabbi Huda says that the case of prat is v'lo lecha with the above. So it sounds like, so again, if Rabbi Huda is going to say that's the prat, and Rabbi Huda is disputing Rabbi Meir, it must be Rabbi Meir would hold that even v'lo lecha ultimately is still a klal. Rabbi Huda, pratabi, and Rabbi Huda disagrees, and he says that it's a prat. Rabbi Yochanan says tarbai Rabbi Meir pratabi. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Rabbi Yochanan infers differently. He says, according to Rabbi Meir, is really what we just said before. Both of those cases are prat. Now, what are both of those cases? Lo lecha, and v'lo lecha. In Rabbi Meir's world, both of those are prat cases. Rabbi Huda, v'lo lecha v'dina lecha. Rabbi Huda says like this. In the case of v'lo lecha, I'll agree that v'lo lecha ultimately is going to be a prat case. The Gemara says v'lo lecha paligna alecha. But in the case of lo lecha, I'm going to disagree. And lo lecha, I'm going to say is not a prat. Lo lecha is still a klal case. Shmuel says like this. Well, that's the case. Ad odile aduye litvok alei plugay. Shmuel says it doesn't make any sense because there's no point. It's very interesting. There's no point in going ahead and discussing the stuff we agree on. Rather, we should discuss the stuff we don't agree on. Shmuel says. So I just want to pause there and just want to reflect on that statement. Right. So that's true in Gemara. Right. Sometimes in Gemara, when you're trying to go ahead and get to a core principle, there's no point in talking about the stuff we agree on because we already agree on it. Rather, again, the point over here is to discuss to highlight the stuff we don't agree on. So that might be true in Gemara, but in life, and certainly after some Klal Yisrael, sometimes the reverse is true. The goal is to focus on the things you do agree on, recognize what a large swath of items that really is, and recognize that sometimes we can't reconcile the stuff we disagree on, but that's okay. Because you see, the whole point of Gemara is to try to reconcile the stuff we disagree about. Okay, so therefore I don't want to talk about the stuff we agree on because that's already done. That's already done. Let's focus on the stuff we don't agree on so we can resolve it. In life, often you can't resolve the stuff you disagree on. So the goal is to highlight the idea that we agree on so much more, and even though there may be irreconcilable differences, it's okay because they're clearly eclipsed by the things we do agree on in life. Such as Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan must listen. Rabbi Yochanan is medayik in the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? We become Rabbi Meir, Shavua, Shein.